Okay, so welcome to the Roundtable on Indigenous Architecture and Placekeeping. My name is Tanya Chumsiamfu, and on behalf of Evergreen and Future Cities Canada, I am thrilled to be here today in the Cardinal Salon of the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, with esteemed elder and master builder, designer, and storyteller, Douglas Cardinal, and highly accomplished and award-winning Indigenous architects and designers, Tamara Begay and Daniel. Tamara is joining us via Zoom from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hi, Tamara. And Daniel is joining us from Seattle, Washington. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
So Future Cities is a collaborative platform that seeks to harness momentum for change that's already present in cities. It brings together a diversity of ideas, innovations, people, and platforms to address some of the most pressing issues and associated challenges facing our communities. This Future Cities Roundtable dialogue will explore the unique ways that Indigenous values, ecologies, relationships to land and place, stories, cosmologies, creative expressions, and resistance are being channeled by Indigenous practitioners such as Daniel, Tamara, and Douglas into exciting holistic methods for building cities and communities that are more restorative, regenerative, community-driven, resilient, and inclusive. This roundtable is also an invitation for architects, urban planners and designers, civic and cultural institutions, and decision makers to learn from renowned Indigenous thought leaders about the value of consulting Indigenous communities, worldviews and methods, as well as engaging decolonizing processes and writing relationships within all city building initiatives that are occurring on occupied Indigenous territories.
As a master builder, Douglas Cardinal's life is dedicated to creating beautiful, thriving, and harmoniously built environments. Born in Calgary, Alberta, his architectural studies at the University of British Columbia took him to Austin, Texas, where he achieved his architectural degree and found a life experience in human rights initiatives. Douglas then became a forerunner of philosophies of sustainability, green buildings, and ecologically designed community planning. His architecture springs from his observation of nature and its understanding that everything works seamlessly together. In recognition of such work, Douglas Cardinal has received many national and international awards, including 20 honorary doctorates, gold medals of architecture in Canada and Russia, and an award from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, for Best Sustainable Village. He was also titled an Officer of the Order of Canada, one of the most prestigious awards given to a Canadian, and he was awarded the declaration of being World Master of Contemporary Architecture by the International Association of Architects. Tamara Begay is the founder of Indigenous Design Studio and Architecture, a 100% Native American woman-owned architectural and planning firm. Ms. Begay is a member of the Navajo Nation, the first Navajo woman registered architect, and has over 14 years of experience working with Native American tribes on connecting culture, language, and tradition through design. Tamara is committed in educating clients on the importance of embracing Indigenous values of design and planning. She is also committed in supporting minorities, in particular Native Americans, in architecture and planning and related fields through business opportunities and professional development. She is a high-level lead or leadership in energy and environmental design, accredited professional, experienced in incorporating current sustainable practices into her innovative planning and design work. As a founding member and current president of the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, Tamarah has long been committed to mentoring junior Native American office staff and students. Ms. Begay is an exceptionally talented visionary, uniquely driven to instill Native American cultural identity in all work that IDS+A designs. Daniel J Kline is the principal architect at Seven Directions Architects and Planners based out of both Montana and Washington. He is a nationally recognized expert in culturally responsive architecture and in green, affordable housing with a focus on work for diverse cultures. Daniel's work reflects his Crow tribal heritage. He holds a Master of Science degree in the Design and Housing program from MIT and a bachelor degree in architecture. Daniel has been featured in the film Indigenous Architecture, Living Architecture, and 4 of his tribal projects have been featured in the book Design Reimagined, New Architecture on Indigenous Lands, published by the University of Minnesota Press. He was selected to be on a national technical advisory team on greening Indian housing for the HUD Sustainable Construction in Indian Country program and is regularly invited as a speaker to conferences and universities. His projects have garnered many professional awards and honors, including the University of Montana Payne Family Native American Center, a LEED Platinum project, and the Place of Hidden Waters for the Puyallup Tribe, and the 2012 LEED for Homes Project of the Year.
So without further ado, I'd like to get into the questions. So I'm going to pose each question and then refer to our wonderful speakers to answer them in order. So the first question, what does it mean to be an Indigenous architect? So Douglas, if you could start us, please.
Well, I believe that one has to look from the worldview of our Indigenous elders. And yes, it's very important to train oneself with as much knowledge as you can get from the European heritage we have in architecture. But I believe that we have to also learn from our elders how to live and be in harmony with the land and in harmony with each other, and follow that spiritual path that the elders teach us, and how we can serve everyone around us and how we can live in harmony with all of life around us. And whatever we do affects all life around us. And so we have to take responsibility with our actions and what we do. And I feel that those teachings are extremely important. I think that that coming from the worldview of our elders and taking all the tools that we have around us and pulling them together, these two worldviews together is the way of addressing our future.
Thank you very much, Douglas. And just a follow-up question to that, what are the challenges that you face in this field in relation to your Indigenous identity?
Well, the challenges we face is that the way that our society is set up, really, it's a top-down structures, patriarchal structures that in a sense are not concerned about as much about the environment or as much about people. It's primarily based on power and control. And I think that that we have to stop thinking from the top down in terms of our planning. But I think we should start coming from the bottom up, from the people's needs first. And that's what I have always felt that it's imperative to address. Instead of following the book about how things should be done, I think we should question everything. What are we doing? Because what we're doing as people is causing havoc on the planet. And what we're doing is thoughtless because we're not considering all life around us, and we're causing tremendous hardship for every species on the earth, and we're causing the earth itself to heat up and create a real catastrophe unless we address it. And so we have to question everything we do and look at whatever we're doing has to have certain basic values. It can't be based on exploiting people, exploiting our environment for monetary gain, because that's what's caused all the problems that we face. We have to address these problems in a different way and come up with a whole new set of values. And that is where we're blessed, in a sense, as Indigenous people, because we have those basic values that have been a part of our culture for thousands of years.
Can I pose the question now to Tamara? What does it mean for you to be an Indigenous architect today?
For me, what it means to be an Indigenous architect means that I have the responsibility, not just as an Indigenous person, but also an Indigenous woman, to reinforce, educate our Indigenous values through design.
Thank you. And what are some of the challenges that you face in this field in relation to your Indigenous identity, and especially as a woman?
Some of the challenges that I face, and a lot of our Indigenous architects and designers also face, is about really discrimination. We are still being discriminated against, by who we are, our culture. And when we're going after projects, we're working for communities. Douglas Cardinal, he talked about, power and control. We go after these projects, and our Indigenous communities have only learned, about, with the European influence about, power and control, and you see that within the communities, and you see a lot of, communities having issues with, health issues, destruction, of their Indigenous architecture. And I think that right now we need to change that, and people need to really look at us Indigenous architects and designers and listen to us, because we're the ones sitting down with the communities, and we're working with the community, really trying to work within harmony. And that is really part of our Indigenous values, is being very respectful to each other, and really listening to the community's needs, their wants, their wishes, what they want for the future. And we have to be very respectful from the very beginning when you start a project. And when they see us, they don't think we're capable of coming into community and you know, designing and planning out their communities. So we have to change that, and the more Indigenous architects that we grow, more people will be respectful, you know, of who we are and our responsibility, you know, to our community, and going back to, you know, our Indigenous values.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. And Daniel, can I ask you the same question? What does it mean for you to be an Indigenous architect, and what are some of the challenges that you face in the field with relation to your Indigenous identity?
Well, I would say first that that the idea of being an Indigenous Indigenous architect is actually something that we have to learn as Indigenous people. When we enter the profession, we are trained conventionally in architecture schools. All of us went to conventional architectural schools where we were trained not to be Indigenous architects at all, but to practice architecture from the conventions of Western European and American approaches to design, many of which are antithetical to how we really need to design as an Indigenous person for Indigenous people. So we have to go through a kind of a re-education of our own to become truly successful as Indigenous architects and to practice an Indigenous architecture. In my own education as a young man, I started in this field very young because my own father's a engineer from the Crow tribe of Montana. I grew up in our office there working on tribal projects, but those projects were not Indigenous in the sense that they were imposed architecture from the outside by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that we deal with in the United States, by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Organization, that dictated to us what we could or could not do as architects, engineers, and planners. And so we had to fight to change that whole system and to eventually gain a voice, both as Indigenous architects and as tribal people, to have sovereignty over what architecture is built on Indigenous land. And I was thinking about this question, and it's kind of a honor right now to reflect on the fact we're sitting here with Douglas Cardinal. When I was 19 years old in architecture school, we had very few mentors to look up to who were Indigenous architects. And I learned about Douglas Cardinal's work as a young man in the School of Architecture, and I saw that there is another way. That I learned that here's an architect who is strongly Indigenous in his outlook and his approach to his architecture, and he's designing buildings from an Indigenous perspective. And it really inspired me to pursue the career of architecture. I actually very much considered not continuing in architecture. Architecture as a practice generally serves corporate interests, it serves wealthy individuals, and I had no interest in that. I wanted to be in a profession that had a positive impact on my own community and on marginalized communities in general. And so seeing what he was doing was inspirational. And then in my own career, really, as a student, I couldn't learn directly from my professors. I had to learn as I went with each project. And what I learned was that the way to be an Indigenous architect and to do Indigenous architecture is to listen to, as Douglas was saying, to our elders, to our tribes. And ultimately, I only believe we're successful when the work that we generate is looked upon by the tribes that we serve as theirs. They see it and they say, this is who we are. And when we've done that, we know that we've created a successful work of Indigenous architecture. As far as the challenges we face, I've reflected on some of those. We've faced many just in practice, in learning to be Indigenous architects and in practicing the architecture. I do think that Tamara made some good points. It's a challenge within the profession itself. It's been a long road for us to become even recognized as a significant part of architecture, a genre of architecture. And this, it's very recent that there are books that are coming out. We're now writing our own books and telling our own stories. We are engaged in things like the Biennale exhibition. This is an important moment for us as Indigenous architects to really reach out to the larger architectural world and say that, hey, there's a different way to practice architecture. And it's very distinct from how it has been practiced. It involves the communities directly. It engages history in a different way. We engage sustainability in a different way. And all of this comes from a process that we have to partake in to generate the designs that we have the great honor to participate in.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So you've touched on a number of my following questions, so hopefully the threads will converge really nicely as we kind of develop each speaker's narrative through the dialogue. So the second question is about, or with regard to the Unceded Voices from the Land exhibit and the fabulous collaboration that Daniel and Tamarah joined forces with Douglas, Cardinal, and a number of different Indigenous architects and designers. And just to kind of let viewers know that it is on exhibit at the Museum of History, the Canadian Museum of History, until the fall of 2020. So please come down and see it. It is truly phenomenal, a very immersive experience. But what I wanted to say just quickly about the exhibit and kind of set up the next question is that the exhibit is such an emblematic and important visual homage to the journey that many people, many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island have been on to assert their sovereignty and reclaim land rights, to heal from colonial legacies and collective traumas, to rebuild their nations, to steward the lands and waters despite all of the environmental challenges, the incursions from different extractive industries, and to represent Indigenous cultural values, identities, and practices through design, architecture, and creative expression. My question then is, what inspired you to show non-Indigenous practitioners and the world the profound ways that Indigenous cultures contribute to how we care for and create place, how we design space and structures, and how we build cities? So I'll put my question again to Douglas first.
I've always felt very inspired by our communities, how they survived, and what they've gone through the last few hundred years, and also the fact that our elders and our teachers are not angry. They still believe that there's a loving and caring way, that the soft power of love is much greater than the hard power of force. And so, in spite of what our people went through, they still believe in giving and caring and sharing. And to me, that was very inspirational because growing up with the attitudes of society filled me with anger and rage. And I found that was affecting my life in a very bad way. And whatever I learned and whatever I studied to be, I would be entirely inhibited by coming into a culture and trying to serve in my profession if I was filled with anger and rage. And I had to change my way of being, and the elders helped me with that through their ceremonies and their rituals. It took me a while to get retrained and to be able to come back to myself and see myself as a loving and caring being instead of an angry, vindictive person that wanted to fight back. And really, that's not the way to accomplish anything. I feel after going through the rituals with my elders, I realized that we are spirits clothed in flesh, and that ultimately, when you go through the ceremonies, you see yourself when you're connected to one's creator, is that you have all the power you need within you to make a difference. You don't need power from outside, or nobody needs to give you power. You have it because you have that gift of creativity. And if you use that creativity in a responsible manner, you have all the power you need to make a difference in your life. And I felt that it was very powerful to come out of the ceremonies with the power of the ego, feeling that you could rise above anything and be able to see all the opportunities of making a difference in your life. And you had no fear whatsoever. And that was very powerful. And so I had to go through all these ceremonies and rituals with the elders in order to understand that in terms of power and control, the way the society operates and has us do this and do that with certain ramifications if you don't do this or do that, that it was much better to be able to just take the responsibility when you see something where you can make a difference in people's lives, is that give yourself permission and the power to do it. And so in my work with communities, when they tell me, well, we can't do this or we can't do that because of some rule, or I'm reminded what Socrates said, rules are guides for scholars strictly adhered to by fools. And so let's make our own rules on behalf of our people and convince everybody around us, particularly governments or institutions, that we have the power to implement our own future, our own reality, our own ceremonies, our own culture, that power is inherent with us, and that each person is sovereign over themselves, taking responsibility of their lives. And I believe that there is nothing that can stop us from making a contribution in our lives through loving and caring. And so this is what I find fundamental to my whole practice. And also encouraging people that when I come into a community, sometimes I've been in communities where people are living in tar paper shacks with nothing. And we sit down together and they have a vision for the future. And we use the ceremonies to understand that and connect ourselves spiritually to remind us that we have the power to change this. And we have the responsibility to our children to change it. And that inspires us to take on the whole world if we have to. And but always in a good way, because that's powerful, to do things in a good way. The elders teach us there's only good and a crooked good that needs to be straightened out. There is no bad, you know. The things that have been perpetrated on us is a crooked good. It teaches us how not to be and how not to behave and how not to treat others. And so it reminds us to treat everybody that's in front of us in a good way. And in that way, we can solve a lot of problems that we have in our communities. And also we can teach the government how to behave.
That's a great word to end on. And Tamara, can I pose the same question to you as well? What inspired you through the Unceded Voices from the Land exhibit to show non-Indigenous practitioners and the world profound ways that Indigenous cultures contribute to how we care for and create place, design spaces and structures, and build cities?
Wow. Well, the Unceded exhibit was it was a very powerful exhibit, and going into it, I had no clue. Going out, outside of the United States, there was a group, about more than a handful of Indigenous architects that put this together. But what inspired me the most, and for me, I didn't want to participate because I think as Indigenous people, we have been taught not to put ourselves out there, that we have to be very reserved in a way, about our work. But my grandmother was a medicine woman, and she would always tell us that, you were born into this world, to Mother Earth and Father Sky. You were born into this earth, and, it's your responsibility when, you become an adult, that you need to educate people about who we are, that we don't lose our heritage, our culture, and our language. A lot of our Indigenous tribes, are dealing and facing with that today. Their identity of, who they are, on, their culture, their language, you know, and then just the respect for, you know, their land. So what really inspired me was, you know what, I have to educate people, because I introduced myself and I introduced myself in my native language, and people are like, well, where are you from? And I say, well, I'm Dene, I'm Navajo, and they come back in a very disrespectful way, saying, well, so you live in a, do you live in a teepee? And I said, well, no, I don't live in a teepee, and it's just how uneducated a lot of non-Indigenous people see us. So, you know, I tell them, I said, well, that's a form of an Indigenous architecture. You know, there's a lot of Indigenous cultures out there, people, you know, that have, you know, specific identities of architecture. You know, some of our people live in them. I said, my people live in hogans. Some people live in modern day homes. And then they go into the question about, well, so you get free health care, right? And just really disrespectful. And, you know, that a lot of this still is in existence today, where they don't know about who we are. And so going into it was about this education about, you know, there's a group of Indigenous architects that are really about, you know, educating our process and, you know, really educating the values of, you know, Indigenous design and planning. And we all share that same commonality, which is respect to, you know, Mother Earth, Father Sky, respect for our water. And, you know, all of that, if we play that together, we can build, you know, better places for our communities. And if you think about our communities, you know, destruction of, you know, of our communities, our culture and our language and our health, a lot of those are influence of, you know, some things that we can look at in our architecture and design, and we can plan things and reinforce to our communities that, hey, you know what, let's go back to our Indigenous values about respecting, you know, Mother Earth, waking up and doing your prayers, you know, and going back to our traditional ceremonies and not be ashamed of them because we do them, that, you know, we're going to be prideful and, you know, be proud of who we are and where we come from. And really that was about, you know, educating people about who we are. And it was such a great experience because a lot of the Indigenous architects and designers explained their storytelling through their design process. And again, we all came back to that same idea of, you know, looking at our journeys through sovereignty, decolonization, and we do same the share values, so we have that blood running through us, which we were all born with, and we were given that gift, and we should all be teaching Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, you know, about the importance of, you know, these values.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. And Daniel, the same question. What inspired you to show non-Indigenous practitioners, the world at large, the profound ways that Indigenous cultures contribute to placekeeping, design of space and structure, and how we build our cities?
Well, I guess in many ways, I feel like over the last few years, our small group of Indigenous architects have really started to see ourselves as kind of a movement, coming together to support one another, which has been really meaningful for me as a, you know, often you feel very alone out there in the non-Indigenous world trying to do this kind of work. And it's been about, I would say, the last 6-7 years that First Nations architects came together with North American, Native American architects in a stronger way. We started to have these collaborations. We started to connect to each other. And then we also started to connect internationally with, particularly with the Maori in New Zealand. And the Maori have been inspirational to all of us. They've invited us to their home territories. We've had conferences there where we've all gathered, and they have been truly inspirational about how they confront their own society, the Pakeha society, as they refer to the white world in New Zealand, and how they're powerfully putting forth their language and culture and demanding that cities that are in Maori territory respect now Maori principles and culture. And it's something we're all trying to aspire to. You know, we look to them. In the United States, we actually also look to Canada as inspiration, because the U.S. in many ways is very behind the ball on this whole recognition of Indigenous people and indigeneity. You all in Canada are going through like a truth and reconciliation process with the residential school trauma that we went through. Most everyone in the Biennale, we are all either direct participants in or survivors of the residential school systems. For example, my grandfather was at the Chamawa Indian School in Oregon. His mother was at the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So we all saw ourselves as unified by similar struggles. And when we go abroad and we are in colonized places like New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we see other colonized Indigenous people, and we all share similar stories. We all have gone through these efforts to destroy our culture, to destroy our language, and yet we're still here. And we as architects are looking at how we within our profession can help to strengthen our own community's identity. And that story, I think, is an important one that needs to be told. And so we've made a concerted effort. I think the exhibition was one of many. We've worked on a book series called Our Voices, Architecture and Indigeneity. We've worked on the handbook of Indigenous architecture. We are participating in international gatherings and speaking out and writing. Very much, you know, none of us are getting paid for any of this. This is all kind of side activity. It was funny, one of our First Nations colleagues was saying that he thought that what we were doing with the exhibition was a good, you know, part of his marketing effort. And I was laughing. I'm like, I don't think we're going to find any clients in Venice for our work when we were exhibiting over there. But we are quite delighted it's now in Canada, and I'm hoping to see it in the United States. But for me as a Native American architect, it was a great honor to be asked by the First Nations architects who do not recognize the border between Canada and the United States. It's one great land mass called Turtle Island, and we are all indigenous to this island. And so they asked us to join them in entering this international exhibition, and we were delighted to be a part of it. And it was a moving experience for all of us to gather together there. It was moving also to be in the place where we knew we were actually in the Arsenale in Venice. an arsenale is a place that it was 400 years old, these buildings, 400 or 500 years old. These buildings very likely were housing the very ships and weaponry that was created to attack and colonize the Americas. And so it was a powerful expression of indigenous prevalence, that we're still here, that our voices are here, and to go to that place and to present our voices in the heart of where this colonization began was very moving, and I think very important. And like Tamara said, she finds, you know, we all find great ignorance about who we are and who Indigenous people are in our own communities. But it's even more so in many respects in Europe. I mean, they have no idea who we are. They do think many of us still live in our teepee lodges or whatever it is. And so it was an effort to teach the world that about who we are, who we serve, and most importantly that we do have a different way that we think isn't just relevant to our own Indigenous communities, but to the world as a whole. And that we all know that the world is on fire. We see what's happening with global warming, and it's frightening to everyone. And as Douglas is saying, we need to listen to our elders. We need to listen to the people that have inhabited these lands successfully for millennia, to learn, to figure out how can we turn around this approach that we've been taking in only a couple centuries that has led to extraordinary devastation environmentally. So this really isn't just about beautiful architecture for our own communities. This is about survival.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So the third question is, from the perspective of Indigenous methodology, community engagement is such an important element of the planning, design, and implementation processes for any type of project that impacts Indigenous communities. How have you been able to integrate community participation and local priorities in the planning and design processes for your projects? So again, I'll give Douglas the first crack at the question.
When a community asked me to come and serve them, the first thing that I suggest is to work with the elders, and particularly the women, in coming together and having a vision session in which the people describe what their vision is for the future and how they can serve their community better through whatever task they ask me to do, to design a community or a school or whatever. And I think that's what we presented in our exhibition, is our concern in caring for people. Because there was architects from London, England. It was a team of women architects who went through it, through the exhibit, and then this architect from London said to me, "I understand this exhibit. I know where you're all coming from." She says, "I wrote a book about it." I said, "Really?" she says, I'll come back and present you the book. And I said, I really would like to read it. And she came back with this book. It says that she wrote. It was called Ideals Before Ideas. She said, what I discovered in my profession in London is that we have to set our ideals first before we even start creating solutions. Like, we have to question, like, what are we doing? You know, why are we doing what we're doing? What are our ideals before we even start? And I really felt, of course, that is what we should be doing, what she is doing in her office in London. And I feel too that in this patriarchal worldview of power and control, we need the voices of the women. And what I find in our communities, that when we have a vision session where we have the elders and particularly the women in the vision session, I find it's the women that gets things done. And without the women involved and supporting the project and making things happen, none of our projects would happen in our community. So I think that we have to respect our traditions where our women were very, very strong in our communities. They were the ones who headed the clan families. And in many ways, the women made the decisions in the home. They made the decisions in the community. And the men, out of respect and honor for their mothers and the mothers of their children, honored the decisions of the women. And I think that we need to reinforce the women's role in the community. And I think as men, we need to support and implement the decisions of the women in the community, because they have the burden of raising the next generation, and they need help in doing so. And our patriarchal system has really disempowered the women. And unfortunately, our men in our native communities have been indoctrinated by the patriarchal system. And it's really caused a lot of problems in our communities. So I always feel when I come into the community that I really embrace and support the women in the community to be able to implement the best vision that we can in the community.
Thank you very much, Douglas. And Tamara, how have you been able to integrate community participation and local priorities into the planning and design processes in your projects?
Part of our process at Indigenous Design Studio plus Architecture is we really embrace the community participatory planning process. And you're not taught that when you're in architecture school. And when you are in architecture school, you get a project and you do research on similar projects, for instance, like a community center. And you get right into the design, and one thing that's missing is the community engagement component. And working with Indigenous communities, having that community participatory planning process is the most vital, important in a project. How we include that is when we start a project, we'll have community members from elders, adults, leadership, and we always try to bring in the youth component. And the youth component is always missing. Either they're at school, they may not have the interest in, designing and planning their communities, but we try to encourage them. Bring the youth in. We want to hear them. We want to hear their voices. So it's just like when you're in a community and you think about how you want to plant corn, the community gets together and they talk about, well, we need to prep the fields. So the men go out there and they prep the fields, and the ladies talk about it, and they talk about the stories. So it's the stories that we listen to that really inspire our parties and our concepts. And as Indigenous architects and designers, we can draw from that storytelling and create a design for the community or a master plan. So if you think about that process, then the women take the corn and they do their prayers. They go plant that corn. And that corn, is preyed upon of, good thoughts. It's being planted in Mother Earth. And when that sprouts up, the corn sprouts up, that brings a value to the community. It brings food and brings enjoyment. And that community participation, and if you look at that analogy, that's what we like to hear. We don't get right into a lot of the programmatic, which we've been learned in architecture school. It's stepping back, giving the community their voice, their time to talk about their stories, their wants, their wishes, and their visions. And it takes a lot. It takes more time, and we have to teach the non-Indigenous designers about that, because that's who we are. When we do community celebrations, it's all about storytelling. It's about having that celebration. And that's really the key component that is taken out, again, of architecture school and the design process when you're working with non-Indigenous people. We enjoy it. We bring food. We have a celebration. We talk to the community members. And it's really important listening to these elders as well. The elders, we had a charrette. We're sitting there, and we're talking about a community center. And one of the elders says, I remember back in the day when we used to sit under this tree. We sit under this tree in a circle, and that shade would provide us some protection from the sun. We'd come here and we'd bring our lunch, and we'd talk about our wishes and our families. Women would come, and they would also participate and talk to us about how we want to plan and how we get things ready. And those stories, from that story, what we did in part of a design is that what we wanted to integrate was some trees. Try to integrate that community, that communal space, where that they could use that space to sit out there, have conversation. A lot of the architecture you see these days, are very enclosed, and we have to look at designing spaces that are more sociable. If you think about how we were brought up on the Western side, they would always tell us, don't cry, don't show your emotions, and don't cry. But we all know that when we hold that in and we hold our emotions in and our anger and we don't talk about it and let that release, we get more angry. So those social spaces, if we can design that where people can have healing spaces to meditate, to think, to celebrate, those spaces are missing in a lot of our communities. And if you think about that storytelling, we can draw from that, and we can visualize the spaces that we are designing, walk through it with their minds.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Daniel, how have you been able to integrate community participation and local priorities into the design and planning processes within your projects?
Well, I learned very early on in my career how critical it is to listen and engage the community. My undergraduate thesis project was in rural Nicaragua. I worked in a tiny little ranch cooperative, and I was doing this thesis. It was a real project, and I just, on my own, I was trying to figure out how to do this. And I literally I borrowed a horse from the ranch, and I got on it and I rode because the people were all living in scattered huts around this large ranch area. And after the revolution, they had gained the land. It had been owned by a wealthy single owner. So they were now in charge as a cooperative. So I had this horse and I rode from little hut to little hut, and I just started, talking to each family. I said, well, what do you want? What do you need? And I had them sketch ideas about what kind of house they would like to have, and I studied their homes and what they were in. And these were people living with 12 family members in a single room, tiny little house. And I was 22 years old, just trying to figure it out. And I'm not even sure how I came to that approach. It just seemed like the natural thing to do. Like, hey, these people are wanting a new community. How do I can't impose that on. I have to ask them. I have to talk to them. I have to listen to them. And I've been doing that ever since. That was the very first project I ever got to do independently, and it was actually a built project afterwards. I raised money, went back, and helped them build it. But that was indigenous Nicaraguans in a rural area. And then, as I continued my career, I learned from people who are experts in participatory design process, and gained more knowledge about how to do this kind of thing. And when I was 20 years ago, I was invited back to my own reservation in Montana to design the Little Bighorn College. And I was invited by Dr. Janine Pease, who was the president of the college at the time. And, this is my own reservation. But even in my own reservation where I grew up, I had to go through a process. We gathered the Little Bighorn College students, the faculty. We created a process where they had a voice, and they could say, hey, this is what we want to see. We brought elders together. We learned about the culture and how we can make it relevant in that project. I think it's very important to point out that most tribal people, as I said earlier, we have had architecture imposed upon us for 150 years or more. So it's actually not usually coming from the client. They've gotten used to being essentially dictated to by professionals. A lot of times the housing departments have been used to having non-Indigenous architects who come in and draw stuff up and say, hey, here you go. They're not used to going through a process. They're also not used necessarily to even the idea that architecture and buildings can reflect Indigenous culture, because it has not for so long. So we have to go through a process at the beginning just to get people on board with the idea of going through a process. And what does it mean to, we have to design that engagement itself. And I think Douglas Cardinal brought up a really good point about the women in these processes. I brought up Dr. Janine Pease in my own tribe. When we designed the Little Bighorn College, she was, the president. She had a powerful voice. She was able to gather people. When we designed the Puyallup Place of Hidden Waters, an affordable housing community for the Puyallup tribe and a community center, we had Annette Bryan, who's the executive director of at the time of their housing authority, now a council member. And it was her power and voice in her own community that brought people together. When we come in from the outside, we're outsiders. Even if we're Indigenous, we're not Indigenous to their community. So we need these strong voices to gather people to say, hey, you know, let's get together and figure out what we want here. When we designed the Skokomish Community Center, we were kind of struggling to get people to come to meetings, and we didn't know what was going on. We were working directly with the council, and it was a lot of mostly men, you know. And then this woman, Kimberly Miller, who is a spiritual leader in the community, she found out what we were doing, and she's like, hey, you know, what do you need? And she went out and she brought the people to the table. She brought food, you know. She figured out how to get voices into the room. So it's not a simple thing, it's a struggle. When we designed the University of Montana Native American Center in Missoula, Montana, we worked with Linda Juneau, who's a Blackfeet educator who was the tribal liaison. And we were working with 12 different tribes, all 12 tribes of the state of Montana. We needed her to help bring those voices, to bring folks from all 7 tribal colleges together to bring their voice to the table to design. So the process is fundamental to the outcome. Without the process, we cannot ever claim to have created anything Indigenous because, as I said, even in my own community, I have to go to the larger community. I can't sit down and say, oh, here's what it's going to be. I have to ask. We have to talk. And I love what Douglas is saying about ideals before ideas. That's exactly what we have to establish. We have to figure out, well, what are you trying to do here? I often talk about building as a verb versus building as a noun. What will the building achieve? What is the goal? What does it do for the community? And ultimately, when we're said and done, we only know if it's successful if people embrace it as their own. As I said earlier, Kimberly Miller, when we went back, we sometimes have the opportunity to go back and do follow-ups, and so I wrote a paper and presented it to the Society of Architectural Historians last year, and so I took that opportunity to go back and interview folks in the design of the Skokomish Community Center, and it was really interesting to hear how they talked about it. And Kimberly Miller talked about how, you know, now when people come to the Skokomish tribal land, they bring them to the Skokomish Community Center, and she said that they know that when people from the outside come into that space, that they are in a Skokomish place. They're surrounded by Skokomish culture and beauty and the patterns of the culture. It's a powerful place. When the building was opened, an elder, Delbert Miller, he said to everyone, he said, when people walk into this space, they'll take a breath in and they go like this. And when they take that breath in and they look around, what they're doing is we are taking in the strength of our ancestors. Our ancestors are speaking to us through this place that we've created. And that really told me that we had succeeded in that project, to hear that kind of response. But to get to that, we had to go through a very integrative process with dozens and dozens of meetings over more than a year to get to the point where we had that kind of a vision, and that, you know, created something that community really embraces.
Thank you, Daniel. So you've all talked about the incredibly important role that women play in the communities that you engage through your design and planning processes. Now I want to just kind of honor the Indigenous women architects that have been the trailblazers for girls and women entering into the fields of architecture, planning, and design. So women such as Tamara, of course, Harriet Burdett Moulton, Wanda Diacosta, and many other Indigenous women. And also Douglas has promoted diverse matrilineal perspectives and forms of planning and governance throughout his career. So in consideration of these trailblazers, these women, Indigenous women trailblazers, what would you like to share with Indigenous and non-Indigenous design firms and municipalities as well about the importance of increasing the presence and leadership of Indigenous women architects and designers? So again, I'll maybe start with Douglas.
Well, for me, I found that a lot of the problems that we face in the world is that primarily all of our institutions, internationally and nationally, are patriarchal systems, hierarchical patriarchal systems of power and control. And I believe very strongly that those institutions and ourselves as men have created a real crisis on this planet for the future and our children's children. And I believe very strongly that we need to empower the women to be always in this natural position of taking responsibility for the children's children and the future, and listen more to the women and have their guidance in coming up with the solutions that we need in the future so that we can all live in harmony together and in harmony with our life givers on this planet, all life around us. And so I feel that it's very important to support the women to take the rightful place as having a strong voice in our humanity and guide us in a better place. As our elders always talked about, the soft power of love is much greater than the hard power of force. And the soft power of love that we learned from our mothers is fundamental to changing things in the future. So I really feel that we should really be supporting women more in all aspects of our governance and all aspects of our institutions. And I think that is the natural way. And elders said, when you turn to nature, the natural way, that's always a good way to live in harmony with our natural environment and our own nature. So rather than being dominion over nature as we're taught biblically. We have to respect nature, and in respecting nature, I think we have to empower the women more.
Thank you so much, Douglas. And then Tamara, you as being one of these, you are the first Navajo woman architect, and the incredible journey that you've taken to get where you are. What would you like to share with Indigenous and non-Indigenous firms, cities, city planners about how important it is to increase the presence and leadership of Indigenous women in this field?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that, I would consider myself a trailblazer, but when I was going through my profession, I wanted to work for a local architectural firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and maybe it was my ignorance back then, but I didn't know that there was Native American architects. And I was at it was a ACES conference, and I was representing the University of New Mexico American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers as a student. I was a president at the time, and I looked across at the conference booth, and there was a lady, ACES, she represented ACES, and she says, "Oh, are you going into architecture?" I did say yes, and I told her, I'm wanting to work for an architectural company, and she gave me a list of Native architects. There was 3 people she wrote on that list, and the first person on the list was David Sloan Architects, and I called him and didn't know that there was a Native American architect. And we're not taught in school. Daniel Glenn was talking about, we weren't taught in school about, Indigenous architecture. You probably you get readings on Indigenous architecture, but they don't go into detail about Indigenous architects. So growing up, I always wanted to become an architect. In elementary school, there was, you have different it was a career day, and you could get your doctors and your nurses, and an architect came in, all dressed in black, had a set of drawings, a model, and I still remember this. And I told myself, that's what I want to be, and I was like 4th grade, and I wanted to be an architect. Growing up, everyone said, I don't know if you want to be an architect, it's going to be very difficult. Went to school and graduated with an architecture degree, and not until I was in the workforce that I realized, when everyone was saying it's going to be very difficult, I finally realized that because I was sitting in meetings, and everyone would think because I was a female that I was there to take notes, that I was there to make coffee. And I remember a contractor sitting there saying, "Well, can you get us more coffee?" And I looked at him and I said, "I don't know how to make coffee." And the look of his face was, "What do you mean you don't know how to make coffee? You're a woman. That's what you're supposed to do." The look of his face. He looked at me so disgusted, and he turned around and said, "Well, does anyone in here does anyone know how to make coffee? Because I need some coffee now." And I just looked at him, and being a strong Native woman, my family, the Native Navajo culture, we take our mother's clan. And I said, "I'm sorry, that I don't know how to make coffee. I don't drink coffee, so I don't know how to make coffee. But there is a coffee pot there. You are willing to get up and make yourself a cup of coffee." So there's a lot of these stories through my career, even being in construction sites, where a lot of the men on the sites are, "Well, where's the architect? Where's the architect?" And the project manager says, "Well, she's the architect. And the look on their face is quite surprising. And they'll say, "You're an architect?" And I'll come back to them. I said, "Well, what is an architect supposed to look like?" And I said, "Yes, I'm the architect." And they're a little afraid to speak to me about my knowledge of construction techniques. It's still that discrimination still happens and exists today, and so that's why it's so important. And I do appreciate Douglas, his words of inspiration. Douglas understands the importance of women in this profession and the women's role, on this planet, because we do play a big part, of raising children, our love and our respect and harmony with Mother Earth and Father Sky. So I take it upon myself to, embrace and educate and employ, Indigenous people, at my firm. And I right now I'm an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico, and I want those Indigenous students, especially the women, to see somebody up there that they can look up to, because I didn't have that, to be inspired by that and say, well, if she can do it, I can do it, and I can be an architect. And also teach in, the university setting, the Indigenous values of, designing and planning, about planting that seed of the corn on a project, before getting right into the design. And, I really think that when people see someone that looks like you, that are, from communities where you're from, they get more inspiration, and then we have to encourage that along the way. Education is very important. When I was part of the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, I participated on the National Diversity Council Board. And one of the initiatives was trying to get young Native women, in particular, my experience in architecture. We partnered up with the AIA, Mattel, and then the Navajo Nation to do a Learn, Design, and Create Architecture event. We incorporated Indigenous architecture values from the community, and we also gave them a toolkit, a backpack, sketch pad, and coloring pencils, at the event. And when we had that, it really touched my heart, because a lot of these communities that we work with, Douglas and Daniel, they don't have all the resources for them. And it really kind of broke my heart, because some of these kids were coming up and hugging me and saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is my first time getting a backpack for school." It broke my heart in a way that, I said, I have to go back out and I have to do these things for my community, educate them about architecture, let them know that there's someone there that has done, has come from the same community as them, and be a role model, and be there for them for their support. And if someone calls my office or emails me, about helping them, through the architectural practice, I will do everything within that day. If they call, try to call them back, because it's important to have that support, especially on, the female side, and giving them that support of, hey, I'm there for you, and I will help you along the way.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tamara. Daniel, I know you have probably an amazing answer for this question. We're running a bit out of time, so I'm wondering if you would mind if I refer the next question first to you, and then we can pick up with Douglas and Tamara. Would that be okay?
Yeah,
just
that's
in the
fine.
sake of time. Okay, sorry about that. So the last question is, the role of the architect goes beyond designing and building. Each of you are also skilled facilitators and interpreters, drawing on technical, social, and cultural expertise in how you empower people to take a pivotal role in the design of their communities. You are also creating awareness about the value of Indigenous architectural principles and modeling their application in your creative and building processes. How do you encourage non-Indigenous urban planning and architecture practitioners to build respectful relationships and dialogue with Indigenous communities? So Daniel, I'll ask you to answer that one first.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry. I thought we were answering the last question of this, but
Yes, or just because we're running out of time, if you would mind, if we could draw your attention to this last question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, one of the things that we do that I think is very important is to be involved in education. I've been both a practitioner and a professor of architecture for many years. I just spent the last quarter as a visiting professor at the University of Washington, teaching a design studio that dealt with Indigenous architecture for the campus, and also I taught a seminar on decolonization and indigenizing the campus and the city of Seattle that combined both native and non-native students in the class. And it was a really, I think, important example of trying to reach out to have a dialogue between Indigenous, non-Indigenous students, for them to learn from each other, and to put out role models for the students. For example, we were talking about the women in architecture, and what I did, one of the exercises in the classes, I had them study Indigenous architects, including, basically I just included all my colleagues from the Biennale, and so it was kind of fun. They were studying my own colleagues, and it was exciting to see how the women in the class really were excited to study the women architects, like Tamara Begay. You were one of the ones who was studied by my students, and it was really inspiring for them to see that you're out there, that you're a native woman architect doing some really significant things. But I think in general that in my own practice, we work with youth, both in the design efforts themselves. We engage the youth to be a part of the process. And as a professor, I've over the years reached out to native students of architecture. There unfortunately are not that many, so it's often this effort to reach out. But for example, I had in my office for several years Kimberly Dariana, who was a student of mine when she was in high school back at Montana State University. I did a summer program, and we reached out to the native youth in the state, invited them to participate in a workshop on architecture for the summer, and that she got into architecture, and then she eventually went into got her degree, and then she came back to me 10 years later and started working for me. So it's very inspiring to see, that sort of process of learning about the profession and engaging in it. I think, this other part of the question about how do we deal with non-Indigenous people in relationship to the work that we do, I think it's often a challenge that we face. A lot of us end up being partnered with non-Indigenous firms in projects, we're asked to be sort of the cultural voice on projects. I'm working on one of those right now for in the city of Portland. I'm working on a native housing project for the city with a non-native firm. And it's like a whole educational process. I mean, the firm we're working with, they just have never worked with Indigenous people. They don't know, you know, the culture and the issues and the ideas and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a challenging process, but it can be very fulfilling when the firms we work with are willing to listen and willing to be a part of that. I have had challenges where they're not so willing to listen, and it can be difficult. But when there's mutual respect, I think that we're able to create collaborative teams. I try to stress that, you know, even though I think we have a great advantage as Indigenous people to work on Indigenous projects. Obviously, we can't design all of the Indigenous work that's out there. There's growing more and more, and there are many non-Indigenous firms that do this kind of work that we compete with and that do the work. And I think the fundamental thing that we try to get out to them is that they need to engage in these kinds of processes. And I taught this to my non-Indigenous students who are working on these, you know, designing a Indigenous housing project, that they need to incorporate the voices of the client that they're working with. They need to listen. They need to be respectful. They need to engage and kind of move outside of their biases that are sort of built in to the profession in the way that they approach the projects. I often find that architects we're designing for each other almost more than we are for our clients. We are designing for the magazines and for the awards and that kind of thing. And often those values are almost antithetical to what we, you know, to the values of the people that we're working for. So we have to set that aside and focus on the needs, desires, dreams, and hopes of the people we're designing for.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. So Douglas will have to leave us very shortly. So I'm going to ask Douglas the following question, and then we'll loop back to Tamarah afterward. So Douglas, how can non-Indigenous practitioners extend land-based and community-informed values and processes more broadly into a regenerative model of designing and building?
What I've found in working with non-Indigenous peoples, architects and planners, is they feel that there's something missing in their own culture and their own ways of doing things. I know in my office we have non-Indigenous people. One day they asked me where I was going. I said, well, I'm going to go out and make my sweat lodge today. Oh, can we come and help? Yeah, sure. And so as I was doing it, they wanted to know the whole principles of putting a lodge together and how you respect the willows, and you know how the elders taught me how to do this. And they themselves said, we want to learn more because we feel there's something missing in our own teachings, our own culture, and also particularly our training as architects. And then after a while, they said, well, can we come in the launch? I said, yes, sure, of course, you're welcome. And so we went through the ceremonies. And then they asked if they could come back to all the ceremonies. And I said, of course, you're welcome. And I know one in particular learned the songs, and then when he became a father, he felt that he had to really respect women more and be supportive of his wife, and more in concern about the future of his baby and the environment and all these things. And in many ways, he has almost become one of us. And I was thinking that, and so when he's putting a building together and we come to a community, he's following the same principles. And I'm finding that when I associate with other architects, we did a very traditional building in university in Saskatchewan for First Nations. And my partner is non-Indigenous, and he not only followed through in working with the elders, he became a real advocate of our Indigenous culture. So I always find that people are really willing to open up and learn. And even when I'm working with government, I worked with Jean Chrétien when he was Minister of Indian Affairs. And he was wanting to learn more and more about our people. And in many cases, I'd come with the people's vision to him that the department didn't want to implement. And he wanted to spend time knowing more about it and the reason why. And he approved some very powerful things, like putting the first school on the reserve that created a precedent for schools on reserves when the people wanted them, instead of busing their children to other communities that didn't respect our children. And so I feel that there are many people that want to change things and want to learn, and it's very important to be open for that, and bringing as many people as you can into your circle and into your friends. Because, and particularly people in strong positions in government and in institutions, because they can, in many cases, really help us. So one has the opportunity of teaching in many ways. And so I feel that it is our responsibility, I feel, to share and teach with as many people as we can about the beauty of our culture and the beauty of our people. And so as architects, I feel I would do a real role of not only producing our buildings, but also being able to have the opportunity to be out there teaching as well. Like you're doing today.
Thank you so very much, Douglas. And we are just so thrilled again to have had you with us. So we will end with Tamarah. I'm going to ask you the last question. You will have the last word of our roundtable. And I'd like to offer of my profound gratitude to all three speakers. You have so enriched all of us with the experiences and teachings and methods, principles, values that you live by, that you embody through your work. You've shared in a very generous and eloquent way all of your wisdom and experience. And I know that I am very, very grateful, and I'm sure all of our audience will be as well once they are able to learn from this roundtable dialogue. So thank you again to Douglas and Tamarah. Just to finish on a wonderful note with you, how do you encourage non-Indigenous urban planning and architecture practitioners to build respectful relationships and dialogue with Indigenous communities?
Well, there's many ways to do that, but most importantly, how we can encourage non-Indigenous planners and architects to be respectful by our relationships is really the most important is to engage with Indigenous architects and planners when they're designing a project, if it's non-Indigenous or Indigenous. They also need to respect the process. They need to, and when they respect the process that they engage in someone, they'll understand that that Indigenous designer and architect has a respectful process, which is really listening to the stories, and it's going to take some time. And you listen, and you listen more, because that's going to be how you're going to be respected in that community, by listening to the stories, of those Indigenous communities or non-Indigenous communities. So this has been really great, and I think we really need to have more of these types of dialogues as a roundtable and a webinar or a podcast, because we are trying to educate, our process and who we are, and the more that people are reaching out and listening to us, especially non-Indigenous practitioners, they'll change their ways of how their processes are. They will also engage Indigenous designers and architects as their process, and hopefully they will change their mindsets of not just using us as cultural consultants, cultural advisors, or just for the communication process. I know Daniel and also Doug and all of the other Indigenous architects out there, they've been brought to projects specifically as cultural consultants or specifically as interpreters, in the Indigenous community for their language of their interpretation. They need to value us a little bit more, because we're not just Indigenous designers and architects, but we're also architects, and we understand and respect that. So I do agree with Daniel. He did speak about there's a lot of projects for Indigenous communities, and we're not going to be able to design and plan them, but respecting our process and looking for a youth that may be interested in architecture, looking to the women and listening to them as their process is going to be the most important thing, really engaging the Indigenous architects, Indigenous communities, and being respectful, to their process.
And that concludes our roundtable dialogue. An immense thank you, Tenki, Ginanas Komatin, Ahehe, Aho to our inspiring speakers, Douglas Cardinal, Tamara Begay, and Daniel Glenn, who have so generously and eloquently shared their wisdom and experiences with us on the issues, teachings, and principles that drive their magnificent designs and structures. Please follow the links that appear on your screen under Resources to learn more about their architectural design and community planning projects.